I do want to ask you a last question about your book, and then we'll zoom out a little more. It seems that one of the central arguments emerging from your analysis is that there was a real flaw in US policy sort of over time, and that was the singular focus on denuclearization rather than an attempt to manage the risk posed by the DPRK nuclear program. Now, what are the implications, in your view, for how the US should deal with other would-be proliferators in the future? In other words, what's the policy advice that emerges from your book?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, I've thought a lot about that. For example, Iran, which is a really big challenge. And even though I've never been in Iran, I came close to going there, but I never did get to Iran. But I've met the Iranians in various places around the world, and we've talked about their nuclear program. So let me give you sort of an example of a lesson learned vis-a-vis Iran. So as I mentioned, for North Korea, we did not make technically informed risk management decisions. So when the Americans finally sat down with the Iranians to negotiate the deal, this so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, I had actually had a chance to meet with the Iranian nuclear and diplomacy people just before the Americans got serious. That is September of 2013. And of course, I shared, my findings and my thoughts with the Americans. But what actually happened during JCPOA, it was done correctly. And so, and what was peculiar, at the same time, while North Korea was going on, and they wouldn't integrate the technology and the diplomacy, in Iran they did. And you can find many photos of their Secretary Kerry, Secretary of State, and next to him is Secretary Ernie Moniz, who also turns out to be a good friend of mine for many, many, many years. And so Secretary Kerry brought the technical person with him. And Secretary Moniz, then, since he was Secretary of the Department of Energy, he had all of the nuclear laboratories at his disposal to advise him, to analyze. And he brought me in several times because I was no longer at Los Alamos. I was at Stanford. And so they put together the diplomatic aspects and the technical aspects. And they really understood the risks they were taking. And the risks they were taking is they focused on the nuclear uranium program. And there was going to be a nuclear plutonium program, but the Iranians actually really walked back from that one. On the centrifuges, they took steps backwards. The risk was the Iranians didn't want to put the missiles into that same deal. And so they made that decision to say, okay, we wish we could do the missiles, but it's better to freeze the nuclear program and walk it back, because if they don't have the bomb fuel, they don't have anything to put on their missiles. So they made that decision. They knew there were risks. And then also they had sort of timelines, as to how long these very agreements would last. Although the one timeline the Iranians agreed to was never to build a nuclear weapon, even though they said they would eventually get back to enrichment. So they made that call on the basis of everything they knew. Now, as I look, however, for the lesson for the government in the future, well, it turns out after that deal was consummated, the Israelis brought new evidence to the table that the Iranians had a much, much farther advanced nuclear weapons effort than any of us knew. And so now what one has to do, and that's the lesson that I would apply, is to say, I wouldn't just go right back to that same deal, because we have new information and you need to make a new risk management decision. And that's the lesson you can take away, that lesson from North Korea, the lesson from Iran #1, as you go into Iran #2. And I think the same goes, and actually, quite frankly, I won't get into that in detail, but India and Pakistan are so much more complicated and difficult yet. Because they are the real issues between the two of them. And we're sort of an outside player. and there's almost no way to get at the basic problem between India and Pakistan. It goes back, to the formation in 1947. So there's some lessons to be learned, but each has to be analyzed in its own way.